was New Year's Eve, 2018. I had just wrapped up my semester at university in Denver and was eager to get back to Montana to spend the holiday with my family. It had been a long and stressful few months, and all I wanted was to get home and relax. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, but of course, nature had other plans. A snowstorm had rolled in that evening, just as I was about to hit the road. The snow started falling lightly at first, and I didn't think much of it. But it didn't take long for the snow to pick up speed, and soon, the world outside turned into a thick, swirling mass of white. It didn't matter much. I had driven in worse conditions, and I wasn't about to let a little snow stop me. I loaded up my car with everything I'd packed, gifts for my family, a few extra snacks, and my dog, Vera. Vera, a scrappy rescue dog, was curled up in the back seat, and for the most part, I felt comfortable driving. The snow was falling steadily now, but it didn't seem too bad. The road was quiet. I hadn't seen another car in miles, just the dark, empty stretch of highway ahead of me, the occasional snow-covered field on either side. The headlights of my car illuminated the road, casting a faint glow on the falling snowflakes. It was peaceful, almost serene, but peace didn't last long. As I was making my way out of Billings and into the open countryside, the car suddenly gave a strange lurch. The engine sputtered, and just like that, everything went dark. I cursed under my breath and tried the ignition again. The engine didn't turn over. I could hear the faint click, click, click of the starter motor, but nothing else. Frustration bubbled up inside me. I was stuck, out here, in the middle of nowhere. I glanced at my phone, but of course there was no signal. I was completely off the grid. With no choice but to figure this out, I got out of the car, pulling my coat tight against the cold and trudging through the snow. I popped the hood and gave the engine a quick once-over. Nothing seemed amiss, but there was no way I was a mechanic. The cold was already sinking in, and I could feel the icy bite of the wind creeping into my bones. I got back in the car and tried the ignition once more. This time, the engine sputtered to life. I let out a sigh of relief and immediately put the car in gear. But just as I started to move, there was a loud crash in the trees. It wasn't the usual sound of a branch breaking under the weight of snow. No, this was something far more deliberate, like something, or someone, was crashing through the woods. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and my mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. It wasn't an animal, I was sure of that. It was too deliberate, too human. I strained my eyes against the darkness, trying to see through the thick curtain of falling snow, but all I saw was a blur of white. I could hear nothing but the wind howling through the trees. Then, Vera started to whine in the back seat. It was low at first, just a soft whimper, but then she started barking. Laddicked. Vera? I called, my voice trembling slightly. She barked again, more urgently this time, and that's when I realized something was wrong. I turned around to see her standing on the seat, ears perked, her body stiff with anxiety. Before I could react, Vera bolted from the car, leaping out into the night. "Vera, no," I shouted, throwing open the door and running after her. I was barely 10 feet from the car when I heard it again. The crash. It was closer now, much closer. Something, or someone, was moving through the woods, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what it was. I shouted for Vera, but she didn't return. My heart pounded as I stumbled through the deep snow, the cold already seeping into my boots. I called her name again and again, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The night was so quiet, save for the crunch of snow beneath my boots and the distant, eerie crash in the trees. I ran deeper into the woods, the snow now coming down harder, swirling in the wind. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. My phone's flashlight flickered weakly in the darkness, casting long, jagged shadows against the trees. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It wasn't Vera. It was a figure, a dark shape, standing still between the trees, barely visible in the snow. I stopped in my tracks, my blood running cold. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a person watching me from a distance. I froze, every muscle in my body tense, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. The figure didn't move. It just stared. I wanted to run, to get back to the safety of my car, but my legs wouldn't move. I felt like I was rooted to the spot. Then another crash came from deeper in the woods, and I snapped out of it. I ran. I yelled for Vera as I sprinted through the snow, but she didn't come. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I spotted her. Vera crouched low near a tree, her body trembling. Her tail was tucked between her legs. I had never seen her like this before. I dropped to my knees and scooped her up in my arms, feeling her shiver with fear. But even as I held her close, something didn't feel right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I glanced around, the sense of being watched overwhelming me. Without thinking, I bolted back toward the car, Vera tucked tightly in my arms. I had no idea if I was heading in the right direction, but I couldn't stop. We finally made it back to the car. I threw open the door, shoved Vera inside, and slammed it shut. I was panting, my hands shaking as I scrambled to get back in the driver's seat. I grabbed the key and jammed it into the ignition. Nothing. The engine didn't even try to turn over. I cursed, panic creeping back into my chest. I tried again. This time, the engine sputtered and then roared to life. I didn't wait another second. I slammed the car into drive and hit the gas. The tires spun in the snow for a second before the car lurched forward. I looked in the rearview mirror, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. And that's when I saw them. 3 figures, standing at the edge of the trees, just outside the reach of the headlights. They were tall, dark shapes, their features hidden by the shadows and the swirling snow. They didn't move. They just stood there, staring at me. My blood ran cold. I floored the gas pedal, pushing the car to its limits as I drove away. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, where I pulled into a gas station, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I sat there for a long moment, trying to steady my breathing. Vera was curled up on the passenger seat, her head resting on my lap. I paid for my gas in silence and got back in the car, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. That night, when I finally made it home, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that the figures I saw were just shadows, nothing more. But deep down, I knew the truth. What I'm about to tell you is something I can't shake, especially around New Year's Eve. It happened a few years ago when I decided to drive out to my cousin's house for a small New Year's gathering. He lives in a quiet little town about 2 hours away, a place where nothing ever really happens. The drive was supposed to be easy, just a peaceful trip to catch up with family. I left in the late afternoon, planning to get there before dark. The weather was fine when I left, but things changed fast. The snow started falling about halfway through the drive, first lightly and then more heavily. Before I knew it, I was driving through a full-on snowstorm. I've driven in snow before, but this storm was different. The visibility was terrible, and the wind made it nearly impossible to see the road. I slowed down and pulled over to the shoulder, figuring it wasn't worth risking driving in these conditions. I called my cousin, letting him know I might be delayed because of the weather. He seemed concerned, but reassured me that everything would be fine. The storm wasn't going to let up anytime soon, so I decided to just wait it out. I turned off the engine to save gas, kept my phone charged, and stared out at the snow, which was piling up quickly. Time passed slowly. I didn't want to waste gas by keeping the heater on too long, so I tried to stay warm by pulling my jacket tighter around me. The wind howled outside, and I began to feel the weight of the isolation. It felt like the whole world was wrapped in a blanket of snow, and I was the only one left in it. Then I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me in the storm, but no, there were lights. 2 sets of headlights moved toward me from behind. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't seen another car for miles. Was it someone who had been driving through the storm or something else? I watched the headlights approach, and eventually a large SUV pulled up alongside my car. The driver, a man in his late 30s or early 40s, rolled down the window and looked at me. He had a rough, almost weathered look to his face, his dark hair covered by a beanie. "You stuck in this storm too?" he asked in a low voice, his accent unfamiliar to me. I nodded, relieved that someone had stopped to check on me. "Yeah, just waiting it out. I'm heading to my cousin's house, but I don't think I'll be going anywhere in this." The man glanced at the road ahead, then back at me. "You shouldn't be out here alone in weather like this. You sure you're okay?" His words seemed more intense than I expected. I tried to brush it off. "I'll be fine. Thanks for stopping. I'm just waiting for the storm to ease up." He didn't seem convinced. "Where's your cousin at? You know he's not going to be able to get out here in this, right?" I felt a sense of unease growing. "I'm sure he's fine. I'll just wait here until it clears." He didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at me. his eyes hard to read in the dim light of his car's headlights. I was about to tell him that I needed to get back to my phone when he spoke again. "I can take you to your cousin's house. It's not far from here. I've got a truck that can handle the roads." I felt a strange mix of relief and hesitation. Sure, the thought of getting out of the storm and into a warm, reliable vehicle was tempting. But something about the man's offer didn't sit right with me. I didn't know him, and the storm had already made everything feel a little surreal. "Thanks, but I'll just wait for a little longer," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll be okay." The man's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes made me feel like he wasn't giving up on this offer. He leaned back in his seat and looked out into the storm, then glanced back at me. "All right," he said finally, rolling up his window, "but you shouldn't be out here alone." As he drove off into the storm, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the whole encounter. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me, making me paranoid. But even as I watched the taillights disappear into the thick snow, my gut told me I hadn't seen the last of him. I spent the next hour glued to my phone, nervously texting my cousin, but there was still no response. The snow was falling heavier now, and the quiet was deafening. It felt like I was the only one left on the planet. I grabbed my keys and jumped into the car, locking the doors behind me. I started the engine and made sure my phone was ready. I wasn't about to sit here any longer. Whatever was going on, I was done waiting. I texted my cousin again, asking him if everything was okay on his end. As I backed out of the shoulder and pulled into the road, I saw headlights again, cutting through the storm. This time, they were much closer, right behind me. I checked the rearview mirror, and there it was, the same large SUV tailing me. My heart started pounding in my chest. I tried to stay calm, but the feeling of being watched and followed was overwhelming. The snow kept falling harder, making it even harder to see where the road was leading. But the SUV didn't seem to mind. It stayed close, following every move I made. I tried to speed up, but it kept pace with me. My anxiety grew, and I couldn't ignore the cold feeling creeping up my spine. I took a sharp turn off the main road, hoping to lose him, but when I glanced in my rearview mirror, the SUV had followed. Panic took over. I knew I had to get somewhere, anywhere, fast. I glanced around, looking for an option, anything. Then I saw a small gas station just up ahead, a lifeline in the middle of nowhere. I slammed the gas pedal down and pulled into the parking lot of the station. Without thinking, I jumped out of the car and ran toward the lights of the station. I could hear the SUV's tires screeching as it turned into the lot behind me, but I didn't look back. I ran inside and slammed the door shut, my breath heavy and my heart racing. The attendant, a young woman behind the counter, looked up in surprise. "You okay?" I couldn't speak at first, trying to catch my breath, but finally I said, "There's someone following me. I think they're after me." The woman's eyes widened, and she immediately picked up the phone. "I'll call the police." I collapsed onto the counter, my mind racing. The storm outside raged on, but I wasn't alone anymore. As the minutes passed, I could still hear the faint sound of an engine in the distance, but it didn't come any closer. By the time the police arrived, the snow had swallowed the SUV and the driver was nowhere to be found. The officers checked the area, but found nothing unusual. They offered to take me to a nearby safe house, and I was grateful for their help. Later, when I finally made it to my cousin's house, I tried to explain everything that had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the whole night had been too surreal to make sense of. I never did find out who that man was or why he'd been following me, but I know one thing: I never drive alone at night in bad weather anymore. I've never been much for big gatherings. Since college, I've gotten tired of the whole party scene. I've always had more fun doing something meaningful with just a few close friends. I grew up in a small town in northwestern Ontario, and this happened a couple of years ago. It's funny, but I've never been one for the holidays. My family didn't celebrate New Year's Eve like most people do. My parents separated when I was younger, so I never really had a big New Year's tradition like some other families. I learned pretty early that New Year's was just another day for me. But that year, my friends and I were craving something different. So I came up with an idea to rent a cabin for New Year's Eve, out in the middle of nowhere. No crowds, no noise, just the woods, the cold, and a lot of quiet. The kind of quiet I've always found comforting. I invited my two best friends, Nate and Trevor, both of whom were more than ready to get away from the usual city life for a while. Nate was the one doing the driving. He had a truck that could handle anything. Big tires, four-wheel drive, the works. The kind of vehicle that felt invincible on roads like these. We packed everything we needed. Gear for hiking, sleeping bags, food, and the one thing we couldn't forget, alcohol. We didn't expect much from the cabin, just a place to crash and some time to unwind. The drive there was long, but the quiet stretches of road and the ever-present snow-covered trees made it feel peaceful. We passed a few small towns on the way, but nothing to worry about, just empty, open space for miles. As we got closer to the cabin, the road got rougher and narrower, and the trees seemed to close in on us. The kind of place where people don't just wander. When we finally arrived, the cabin looked just like the kind of place I expected. Old, isolated, nestled between towering pines with a small porch and dark windows. The kind of place that screamed seclusion. And that was exactly what we wanted. No distractions, no noise, just us. We unloaded the truck and headed inside. At first, everything felt fine. The fire crackled in the old wood stove. The place had that musty, lived-in smell you expect from a cabin, and the snow outside added to the atmosphere. We cracked open a few beers and spent the evening talking about everything and nothing. The kind of conversations that make you realize how much you've missed the simplicity of being away from everything. But as the night wore on, something strange started to happen. The quiet outside seemed too quiet, the kind of stillness that felt wrong. I brushed it off at first. After all, we were deep in the woods, but the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I got. Trevor seemed to feel it too, and before long, we both noticed that Nate had gotten unusually quiet. Around midnight, we heard a knock at the door. It was sharp and loud, echoing in the silence of the cabin. The three of us exchanged confused looks. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere, knocking on our door? There were no neighbors for miles. Nate, being the brave one, stood up and went to the door. He looked through the peephole. There was nothing. No one was standing there. Just empty snow, the dark outline of the trees against the moonlight. He shrugged and came back to the fire. "Weird," he said. "Maybe it's an animal or something." But we didn't hear anything else for a while, so we tried to ignore it. We figured it was just our imaginations running wild. After all, we were in the woods. Weird stuff happens sometimes. The next hour passed without incident, and we were starting to relax again when the knocking came again. This time it was louder, more urgent. We all jumped to our feet. Nate went back to the door, his brow furrowed. He looked through the peephole again. Still nothing. At this point, Trevor looked at me with wide eyes. "Something's wrong, man," he whispered. "We should call someone." I agreed. There was no way anyone could be out there. But before we could even make a move, the door handle jiggled. It was subtle at first, like someone was testing it, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. We all stood there, frozen, listening. Suddenly, the door swung open. I don't know how it happened. 1 second, we were all huddled in front of the door, and the next it was wide open. The air was cold and sharp. My first instinct was to slam it shut, but I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, like something was pulling me forward. Standing in the doorway was a man. His face was pale, eyes wide, and his clothes were soaked, dripping with water. He was shivering, and his hands were trembling as he reached toward us. We need help," he said, his voice shaking. It's the others. They're coming." The man didn't make any sense, and before any of us could respond, we heard something in the distance. A noise cutting through the night, unnatural and hollow. A faint echo of footsteps, getting closer. The man looked over his shoulder, his eyes filled with fear, and then without another word, he bolted into the woods, disappearing into the snow-covered trees. We didn't know what to do. We stood there staring at the open door, the cold air rushing in, and then the noise. Those footsteps stopped, and then everything went silent again. We debated for a long time, weighing our options, but the unease lingered. Eventually, Nate picked up the phone to call the authorities, but there was no signal out there. No one could help us. We locked the door and huddled together by the fire, not knowing what to do. We heard the sounds again, but this time they weren't footsteps. It was something heavier, something that didn't belong. We all knew it. In the end, we never saw the man again, and we never found out who or what was out there. We stayed in that cabin the rest of the night, watching the snow fall outside, but the whole experience left a scar on all of us. We never talked about it again, and to this day, I still can't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us that night. Maybe we weren't supposed to be there at all.